expected always when there's a recession, the rebound is normally big because it's coming from a low base. So globally we had 5.9% economic performance, and this was really across the globe. I think all continents registered good performance, and we expect this to continue in 2022 and 2023. This is linked to economies opening up, international trade really improving, and investments going up in different parts of the world. So this will really be showing you how this is impacting us. Let's go to the next slide. This looks at the prices, the commodity prices. As the economies are picking up, demand for commodities mainly used for industrial production has increased, and with that prices increased. But these are increasing from a decline we experienced last year. I mean 2020. Because of the shock, the COVID shock, prices went down globally. So this increase in commodity prices has an impact on our economy from both ends. It's positive and negative in a way. So when we start with the energy index, the increase in crude oil of 79.4% in the last quarter itself, or 67.4% increase in 2021, that impacts us on our import bill for oil commodities. So that is impacting us negatively. But when you look at the non-energy index, that includes the minerals, includes agricultural products, that impacts positively on our economic performance. So as you see in our external trade numbers, imports are increasing partly because of the high increase in our import goods. But we see a significant increase again in exports because our exports are dominated by commodity exports. So this picture will really be shown in our external trade. And in a way, let's go to the next slide, because these increases in commodity prices, but also the high performance of the global economy impacted the global inflation. So we see inflation last year increasing by 4.3% globally, and this is expected to further increase by 4.8% this year, 2022. And this is linked really to the high performance of the global economy in general, and that impacts our economy, our inflation as well, again, as we'll see on the part of inflation for our country. Now, zeroing on our domestic economy, as you seen from the publication from the Institute of Statistics, 2021 was a year really of recovery. In fact, high recovery, much higher than we had anticipated at the beginning of the year. So in the first 3 quarters, the economy registered a growth of 11.4%, and this was coming from a recession of negative 3.4 we had registered in 2020. And we can attribute this recovery to the government economic recovery plan that the Ministry of Finance published mid-2020 to deal with the pandemic. Then as vaccination increased and as the pandemic eased, restrictions were also eased, and this allowed the economy to open up. Again, we had good weather conditions in 2021, so agriculture performance was good. So these re-impacted on the good performance of the economy in the first 3 quarters. And when we look at the Composite Index of Economic Activity that we track from the central bank point of view, that gives us an indication of the direction of the economy. it indicates that in the quarter 4, the economy was still performing strongly. So we see the composite index growing by 13.4%. As you see, we had registered 10.3% growth in Q3. So this gives us confidence that when you look at the CIA and the turnovers, the growth in the turnovers, both of services and industry, it gives us confidence that the projection of 10.2% overall growth of our economy for 2021 will be achieved. So we wait for the final numbers in March. I think that's when the Institute of Statistics will be publishing the numbers. But when you look at these frequent numbers, we track Q4 was also a good quarter in terms of economic performance. Now, going forward, we expect this to be sustained in 2022. I think so far the projections we have is around 7.2% growth in 2022. Again, this will be supported by the economic recovery plan. Part of the bigger plan is the Manufacture and Build to Recover program by government that's supposed to boost manufacturing and construction sectors. Then we'll see continued opening of the service sector. As you heard, we expect to finally host CHOGM in June this year. So that's an indication that the tourism sector is opening up. So we expect the service sector to continue opening up. Of course, there's always a caveat because we are still in the pandemic, it's not yet really declared over, so that remains the risk, the negative risk around these projections of good economic performance. On the external sector, as I said, because of the increase in commodity prices and the opening up of the global economy, we saw a significant increase in our exports, growing by, commodity exports here, growing by 53.4%. So this was mainly driven by the traditional exports linked to commodity exports mainly, but also the non-traditional exports linked to manufacturing and new agriculture and horticulture. That also helped to increase our export earnings. We saw similar increase in imports, again, as I said, because one of the increase in the commodity prices we import, like oil, but also the increase in demand of intermediate goods for manufacturing, for industrial consumption, and capital goods for investment. That pushed up our import bill by 16.5% in 2021. Though the growth in exports were much bigger than the growth in imports, the base are completely different. The base for imports is really big, and therefore that caused a widening of our trade deficit by 2.4%. On the depreciation of the Rwanda, we saw lower depreciation than we had projected and than what we experienced in 2020. This is mainly linked to the good performance in exports, as I have just said. So we saw good performance in exports, and therefore that means increased foreign exchange earnings. And so that ensured less pressure on our Rwanda, and so this depreciation was 3.8% for 2021. And this is expected to remain stable this year. We project depreciation to be around 5% for 2022. So on the monetary policy side, as you know, we maintained an accommodative monetary policy throughout the year from April 2020 till now, and so that had an impact on the rates, interest rates, starting with the short-term interbank rates that we normally target when we move our policy rates. So that reduced from 5.35% in 2020 to an average of 5.18% in 2021, and this is linked to the lending rates that also reduced during the course of last year by 17 basis points to 16.18%, and we saw deposit rates slightly increasing. So this one is mainly linked to big depositors increasing their deposits, but also some depositors now deciding to deposit for more than 1 year. So at least we started seeing deposits of 2 years to 5 years, so that increases the deposit rate as well. But generally speaking, the direction of the interest rates were in line with the monetary policy stance. And the monetary aggregates also saw continued growth of the money supply, which we call M3, by 17.8%, more or less similar to what we had last year. And then the credit private sector also increasing, linked to, I think we'll see it in the side of financial stability. We saw a big increase in new authorized loans during the course of 2021 as the economy was recovering. So on inflation, last year again, as you followed the publications from the Institute of Statistics, inflation remained subdued during the course of the year. So increasing to 1.2% in Q4 from negative 0.6 in Q3. Overall average inflation for the year 2021 was, I think, 0.8%. So this has started picking up and mainly linked, I think here is breaking down what we see up there. So let's proceed. Yes, so as I said, we see core inflation increasing, energy inflation increasing, and agriculture inflation has also started picking up, I think, this quarter. But last quarter it was still very low at negative 8.6 in Q4. Continue. So currently, that is in January, inflation has increased to 4.3%, and our projections indicate that for the year it will be slightly below 8%, or on average 7.5% for the average inflation for 2022. And when we continue to the next slide, so we see global growth, as I said, will continue to strengthen, but still faces some challenges linked to COVID. Elevated inflation is expected to persist longer than projected, and this is expected to continue to be high in 2022. We see good economic recovery in our country. Last year, as we said, expected to be in double digit. This year we expect it to be around 7.2%. And the near-term inflation indicates uptick in inflation of food, core inflation, and energy inflation. And so because our projections indicated that it threatened to go above our upper band of 8% by end of the year, so the monetary policy decided to increase the central bank rate by 0.5% to 5% to contain the inflationary pressures we see. Though there has been this increase, we expect, or we see this still accommodative, and so while we'll be supporting economic growth, sustained economic growth by containing inflation, because inflation is can be detrimental to good economic performance, but also the rate will continue supporting economic recovery. So that's on the part of the Monetary Policy Committee. When we look at the Financial Stability Committee, this we've shown it every quarter. I'm sure you all know the structure of our financial sector, and I mean the performance of our financial sector has been strong, and so it continues to increase. As a percentage of GDP, which is the good measure, we see it increasing from 57% in 2019. We are now at 69%. That's total assets of the financial sector, so they continue to grow. And then it's really dominated by the banking sector, and happy that the banking sector assets also continue to grow. Last year, and so even from 2020, last year we saw positive growth, and we continue to see good financing of the private sector by the banks, as the big chunk of their assets is in loans to the private sector, as you see at 53.6% in 2021. Then on the loans, yeah, we saw loans, as I said in the slides earlier, increasing by 15%, and then this was mainly driven by new authorized loans increasing by 15.4%. Though there was write-offs of 75 billion last year, that's write-off of bad loans. And this big increase of write-off of bad loans from 2020 was mainly linked to delayed write-offs because of the pandemic we are in. We allowed banks to delay the write-offs, as they allow their borrowers to see if they can recover and be able to continue servicing the loans. But then at the end of the year, they had to write off. So that's why we see that big increase. Well, we had that big write-offs and big provisions, of course. The good thing is that the capital base of the banks is still strong and able to contain any shocks. So as always, we measure this through capital adequacy ratio, and we see it at 21.5% in 2021 compared to a minimum of 15%. They shouldn't be going below. So this, in simple terms, is to say the banking industry is sitting on a healthy capital base and therefore strong enough to absorb any shocks. As I said, this is after absorbing the shocks of increased write-offs and the increase, as you see in the, let's go to the next slide. Yes, so this is on the quality of the loans. So we saw non-performing loans as a ratio to total loans reducing to 4.6%. That's below our benchmark of 5%, which is good. But we saw loans in what we call category watch. Those are loans that have missed their loan service by between 30 and 90 days, increasing. In fact, increasing significantly during the course of the year. And that, as I said, that increases provisions as well. So the good thing is that despite this increase in provisions linked to watch category loans, banks are still sitting on strong capital base. But this is something that we are watching closely in terms of the quality of the loans of the banks. On microfinance institutions, more or less same picture, good performance of the assets of the microfinance institutions, increasing by 18.3%. This was also linked to the opening up of the economy, increased lending and increased deposits from their clients that allowed them to continue lending. Yeah, as I said, these are deposits increasing and equity in the sector. In terms of the quality of the loans, we saw outstanding loans increasing, and this is breaking it down between the SACCOs. There's big increase of loans within the SACCOs more than the other subsectors of the microfinance sector. But overall, we see good performance of the sector in terms of increasing intermediation to support mainly rural development. Looking at the stability indicators, we also see healthy indicators in the microfinance institutions. Overall, their capital adequacy ratio standing at 35.8%, also compared to 15% minimum requirement. So all the indicators in the microfinance institutions are really positive, and we also see NPLs reducing to below 5%, our benchmark level, increased profitability, so healthy numbers here for the microfinance sector as well. Same story in the insurance sector. We saw insurers growing their premiums, written premiums last year. No, these are assets which are linked to premiums anyway. So the assets also continue to grow. So yes, this is growth of premiums by 21% last year, which is a positive development in the sector. So, but this is linked to no, please stay on that. So I was saying the growth of the premiums was linked to a rebound in the economy, the performance of the economy, but also increased premiums or prices of premiums of motorcycles and non-motor insurance prices, as you had at the beginning of last year. But again, we saw increased claims, mainly linked to motor and medical. Let's proceed. On the pension fund, we saw investments growing, and so their assets growing, and so this is also a positive story in the pension fund. More important is on the private pension, because we see this growing as well. No, please. Private pension, this side, yeah. So on the private pension, this has been growing over the years, and we see at least Rwandan that were excluded from the public pension fund, RSSB, we see them benefiting from the pension fund institutions or schemes. As you can see, the pensioners or the savers have increased from 51,000 to 66,000, and this is really a good development, which is similar to Ejoheza. On the next slide, Ejoheza has also continued to grow in terms of their assets and contributions and members. So this is a summary of the assets, the increase in assets of Ejoheza more than doubling in 1 year, which is also a positive development. Now on payment systems, we see a change with the change in policy of payment systems. Here we see the value of the amount transacted on the payment system channels. We saw increase in person-to-person transactions, though there was slight reduction in person-to-business because of the reintroduction of the charges on MomoPay. But that after the reintroduction remained more or less constant. Then on the merchants, again, after the introduction of the charges, we saw the active merchants reducing slightly, but remaining constant after that, and the active users using merchant payments also remained constant throughout the year. This shows more transactions going digital or electronic. When you look at the first graph, shows cash in much higher than cash out in the more mobile money network. Same when you look at the bank to wallet and wallet to bank, we see more money leaving the wallet going to bank than money leaving the bank going to the wallet. So this is a positive development, showing that people are transacting more using electronic channels and improving, at least there's improvement in using electronic channels and reducing the cash channels. So in conclusion, the financial sector is expected to continue being stable and sound, as we saw across the subsectors of the financial sector. They have healthy capital and good liquidity, and the bad assets really have also reduced. and we'll continue to monitor and assess potential sources of risk. As I said, credit still remains a risk linked to the uncertainties around COVID-19. But overall, we see a stable and strong financial sector, and we'll continue engaged to avoid any adverse effects linked to the current environment we are in. So briefly, that's a summary of the outcomes of the two meetings. Now happy to invite any questions from the media. I have my colleagues here, so we'll be working together to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Muri uyu mwanya tugiye kwakira ibibazo. Mushobora kuvuga mu Cyongereza cyangwa mu Kinyarwanda, bw'amazina yawe na media house muturutsemo. Murakoze.
Okay, murakoze. Nitwa Hakizimana Daniel, nkora radio na televiziyo Flash. Ikibazo mbaza, hashize igihe abaturage babona izamuka ry'ibiciro umunsi ku munsi. Ese mwanavuze ko muri Mutarama uyu mwaka byazamutseho 4.3%, ariko umuntu yakwibaza ngo ese twavuga ko byacitse, ese hari icyizere ko mu minsi iri imbere bizongera bigasubira nk'uko byahoze? Hanyuma ikindi navuga, muravuga ko mwizeye ko ubukungu bw'igihugu buzakomeza kuzamuka muri uyu mwaka, ariko umuntu ashobora kwibaza ngo ese uretse mu buryo rusange gufata umusaruro mbumbe w'igihugu ko uzazamuka, ese hateganywa iki ku buryo ukuzamuka k'ubukungu bw'igihugu bigaragara no muri rubanda rusanzwe, n'ubukungu bw'umuturage nabwo bukazamuka? Murakoze.
Murakoze, Dani.
I think let's answer one by one. So, yes, murakoze. Izamuka ry'ibiciro ku masoko nibabonye imibare twatanze, mu by'ukuri umwaka ushize muri rusange, iyo tuvuze inflation ngo tuvuga izamuka ry'ibiciro muri rusange, ibiciro by'ibikoresho dukenera twese. Mu mwaka ushize ntabwo byazamutse cyane ugiye kufata muri rusange byose mbumbe, ariko hari ibwo tuvuga urugero nk'umwaka ushize ngo hazamutse nk'amavuta yo guteka, hazamuka I think school fees zarazamutse. So hari ibintu byazamutse ariko bitavuze yuko inflation yazamutse muri rusange. So wenda rero byumvikane ko ntabwo kuba twagaragaza ko inflation yari hasi cyane mu mwaka ushize hatari ibintu byazamutse, ariko kubera ko uruhare runini rw'ibyo abanyarwanda bakoresha ari ibiribwa, iyo ibiribwa bigiye hasi bituma ya inflation muri rusange ijya hasi. Niyo mpamvu ubona mu mwaka wose inflation yari kuri 0.8%, kubera ko ibiribwa byari muri negative, ibyo biciro byabo byari byagabanutse ugereranyije n'uko byari bimeze muri 2020. So ubwo rero niyo mpamvu navuga ngo iyo turebe muri rusange nuko bimeze. No uyu mwaka, iyo turebye uyu mwaka nk'uko mwabibonye mu kwezi kwa mbere, tubona ibiciro bizazamuka kubera ko binaturuka hasi cyane, bituruka hasi ugereranyije uko byari kuzamuka uyu mwaka. Turabibara dushingiye uko byari bimeze mu mwaka ushize. Iyo rero tuvuge nk'ibiribwa byari muri negative kubera ko twagize umusaruro mwiza mu mwaka ushize, ubu byatangiye kuzamuka. Iyo bitangiye in fact no muri first quarter byari bitarajya muri positives, ariko niba byari muri negative 8 bikaba byagiye muri negative byazamutse kuri kangahe? Negative 5. So n'ubundi biba byitwa ko byazamutse. Niyo mpamvu rero twafashe icyemezo nka Central Bank yo kuzamura urwunguko rwa banki nkuru y'igihugu, kugira ngo dutange ubutumwa, tunagerageze gufasha kwirinda ko uyu muvuduko tubona ubu ngubu wazamuka cyane bikarenga ibipimo tuvuga ko bitagombye kurenga kugira ngo byo kuhungabanya ubukungu. Tuvuga ko inflation, ubwo ndavuga inflation bya biciro byose, ntavuze gazi yazamutse ubu ngubu. Kuvuga ugiye kubona gazi yarazamutse nibyo, ariko ugiye kwibara muri ya mbumbe y'umunyarwanda cyane usanga gazi wenda ari nka 0.1%, ku buryo niyo yazamuka cyane muri inflation uzabona wenda itagize, ariko bitangiye kuzamuka byose nkuko twavuze hano tubona ari ibiribwa bizazamuka, ari ibikomoka kuri peteroli bizazamuka, ari ibindi twita ko nabyo bizazamuka. Niyo mpamvu twafashe icyemezo cyo kuzamura urwunguko rwa Central Bank. Ariko icyo cyemezo twafashe n'iyindi mibare tubona y'ubukungu bwose dusanga ku mpuzandengo bitazarenga 8%. Icyo gihe bitarenze 8% ntabwo bigira ingaruka mbi ku bukungu muri rusange. Niyo mpamvu n'ubu tuvuga ngo n'ubukungu tubona buzakomeza kuzamuka bikajya hejuru ya 7%. Waje utakorwa ikirere kugira ngo ubukungu bugere ku bantu bose. Hari ingamba za leta zitandukanye. Ubwo wenda Minisiteri y'Imari ishinzwe ingamba zo kurwanya ubukene ndumva bitanga kenshi, ariko hari ingamba zitandukanye zo guteza imbere icyaro. Hari byinshi bikorwa nta kwirirwa njyamo hano kuko ibi ngibi reka tugume kuri politiki ya monetary policy. Nitujya kujya muri detail z'ibikorwa n'izindi nzego za leta dushobora kubisobanura uko bitari byaba byiza bisobanuye n'ababishinzwe bo umunsi ku wundi. Hanyuma yego numva ari icyo ngicyo kindi warabajije.
Thank you, Governor.
Murakoze, nitwa Jean Paul Turatsinze, naturutse kuri RBA. Ndashaka kubaza ku kintu tumaze iminsi tubona ku kijyanye n'izamuka ry'agaciro k'idolari ugereranyije n'amafaranga y'u Rwanda. Ese nka Banki Nkuru y'u Rwanda ibi mu bivugaho iki ko tubona mu mibare mwagiye mutugaragariza tubona ko ku bijyanye n'iby'u Rwanda rwohereza hanze biragenda bizamuka cyane, n'ibyo rutumiza hanze naho ubigeranyije ubona ko atarimo icyuho kinini. Ariko se biraterwa n'iki? Ingamba zo ni izihe? Murakoze.
Murakoze. Biraterwa n'imiterere y'ubukungu bwacu. Nkuko byagaragaye nanone no mu mibare, dutumiza ibintu byinshi hanze ugereranyije n'ibyo twohereza hanze. Kubera ko dutumiza ibintu byinshi hanze bidusaba amadovize menshi kurusha ayo dukura hanze. Buri gihe rero hari icyo kinyuranye hagati y'ibishakwa n'ibigura ibyo bishakwa, igiciro kirazamuka. Hakorwa iki rero kugira ngo bishobore kugiraho bigabanuka mu buryo bugendanye n'ubukungu n'ugukomeza kuzamura ibyo twohereza mu mahanga? Ko iyo ibyo mushaka gukura hanze ari byinshi nyine bikenera amadovize menshi, bisaba ko niho hava iyo demand na supply bigatuma habaho guta agaciro k'ifaranga. Ariko twebwe nk'uko tubisobanura buri gihe, kubera ko bigendanye n'imiterere y'ubukungu bwacu, tubona uko bigenda bizamura, ni ukuvuga ngo uko ifaranga rita agaciro bituma ibintu dukura hanze bitaza guhenda kurusha ibyo twakora mu gihugu iwacu. So somehow hari n'ukuntu bigenda bituma wowe wakoreye mu Rwanda ugiye gucuruza hanze biguha agaciro k'ibyo wohereje hanze cyangwa se ibyo ucuruza mu gihugu. Ntibibe ugiye gufunga ifaranga wasanga ibyo utumije hanze bije bihendutse cyane kurusha ibyo ukorera mu gihugu, bikica inganda zo mu gihugu cyangwa se bikicwa ibyo mukorera mu gihugu. Icyo gihe rero ibyo twita ifaranga kuba ryapigana ku rwego mpuzamahanga nuko rigendana n'imiterere y'ubukungu kumeze. Igisubizo rero ntabwo ari igisubizo wabona none ahangaha, ni igisubizo kigenda kiza buhoro buhoro uko tugenda tuzamura ibyo twohereza mu mahanga. Nanone ikibazo gikomeye nacyo gihuye n'ibyo ngibyo ariko nabyo kirimo igisubizo, nuko kubera ko turi igihugu kiri mu iterambere ryihuse turakeneye ibintu byinshi biza mu ishoramari. Kubera ko dukeneye ibintu byinshi biza mu ishoramari birongera y'amafaranga dukenera gutumiza ibyo bintu hanze. Ariko icyizere bitanga nuko uko biza mu ishoramari birongera ubushobozi bwacu bwo gukora ibyo twakeneraga gukura hanze tukabyikorera, ariyo made in Rwanda, tukagabanya ibyo dukura hanze, noneho tugatangira no gukora natwe ibyo twohereza hanze. Icyo niyo nzira yonyine izagera kugabanya kwaguta agaciro kw'ifaranga.
Thank you, Governor. Have a question, comments?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. I think it's afternoon. Right? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Collins Mwai. I write for the New Times Daily. I have brief follow-up questions with regard to to some of the highlights of your remarks. One is that if you look based on the current and unpredictable weather patterns, would it be right to say that the biggest risk to inflation and the cost of living at the moment is the weather, because it would further drive the prices of food? And with that, what's the worst case scenario that you would foresee in terms of the rate of inflation? Would you see it going above 10%, given if we were to have unpredictable weather patterns? Secondly, is I noticed an increase in credit. Again, considering the NPLs, who are we lending to, or who are banks likely lending to, and which sectors are you considering safer as we go by or as the economy opens up? Third is something that was not in the slides, but I would like to ask, what's the central bank's position, ability, and readiness to regulate fintechs? I'm asking this because if you look at the continental startup and SME investment profile, we see a lot of money going to to fintechs. We see a lot of demand, and we also see the role of fintechs, especially in emerging economies, to support what banks have not been able to do. I mean, be it buy now and pay later, be it in money transfer, be it in more affordable cross-country money transfers. So what is our ability, readiness, strength, capacity, and also if challenges, if we have any, because we still notice that we've probably had the same number of fintechs for a number of years, and we don't have much activity in the fintech sector. Lastly is for pension funds, do you have an idea? I mean, it's good that the number of pension funds are growing and the number of savers. Do you have an idea where they are investing this money? Because in the long run, it's supposed to make loans cheaper, or it would serve to make loans cheaper, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Collins.
Thank you. I'll request my colleagues to chip in. Let me just answer your last question. Then I'll request Thierry to answer the question whether and its impact on inflation. Then Peace would handle the lending and the fintech regulation. So where are the pension funds investing their money? Because they are still new, they are not yet strong enough to manage risk. They have decided to invest in government securities. In fact, almost 100% of their money is invested in government securities for now. So as it grows and as they build their capacity to manage other risks, then they can diversify their investments. Thierry?
Thank you, Governor. What I can say about weather is you're right in terms of risk, because in general, weather conditions determine the agricultural production, and the agricultural production are also determining prices of food product. But what I can say is that we have had years which weather was not so good and prices of food increased, and we have had years like last year, 2021, where the weather was very good and the opposite happened. Price of food were very, very low. So this is something that we are going to keep monitoring, but for this year, overall for the entire year, so there are risks on the upside and on the downside, which makes we think our projections for the moment are realistic. And the risk that can be higher or it can be lower depending on how the seasons go. So what we'll do is that we monitor when the data for the production is out, and when also we have monthly inflation data, so that we can know whether or not to adjust. But for the moment, we think projections are realistic. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Governor. So to respond to Colin's questions, one on I'll start with the fintech one on readiness for the central bank to regulate fintech. I think that I would say two things to this question. One is our regulatory approach is not institutional specific. It is it follows what is the underlying business that you're in. So either you're in banking or you're in insurance or you are delivering payment services, remittances, or you're an aggregator. So it doesn't matter how the service is delivered. What is regulated is the service that you're delivering. So our approach will not differ on whether you're delivering it through technology or through brick and mortar. So that's question one. So that broadly responds to how ready are we. So the regulatory framework that exists for all these sub-sectors is sufficient to supervise fintechs as well. What you may be alluding to, I suspect, is for those that are emerging and are still trying out their technology, or they are in a service that is not regulated, in which case we have a sandbox environment within which we regulate. We do have a sandbox framework that has been in place for a couple of years now. We're reviewing it. In fact, in the course of this year, we'll be gazetting a revised approach to sandbox environment. So maybe to speak to that also is to also clarify that we've actually already seen a lot of uptick in fintechs, especially in the payment space. You'll see that in the last maybe 3 years or so, we've actually licensed a number of new payment service providers. You're probably alluding to Flutterwave and all the noise that it was making yesterday. It's actually also licensed and operating in Rwanda as well. So we do have a number of PSPs that have emerged in that space, or fintechs that have emerged in that space. Yes, and then the sandbox environment that responds to new ones. Maybe just a small clarification to provide on private pensions. I think that what Governor alluded to significant investment in government securities is largely for Ejoheza, but for the private pension schemes, we actually do have a diversified investment portfolio where they've invested in equities, listed and unlisted, in real estate. About just a little over 10% of their portfolio is in deposits in banks, and then also in government securities. So they do have a diversified portfolio for the private pension scheme. In terms of lending, allow me to probably cross-check and see where the new authorized loans have gone to in terms of sector by sector. But one thing that we are pleased of is that we see increased lending in the manufacturing sector. It's one of the areas that has been raised as a concern. And over the years, we've actually seen the manufacturing sector progressing to, I think, now being the third or the fourth most finance sector in Rwanda. Manufacturing in itself is quite broad. So you have manufacturers in cement, for example. You have manufacturers in construction materials, steel bars and things like that, in food processing. So you see increased lending in the manufacturing sector, but we can get you a breakdown of detailed new authorized loans and which sectors they've gone to. Thank you.
As a clarification, please, if you were to offer an expert's opinion on what would we do, either as a market to either increase the number of eligible fintechs or to have more homegrown fintechs, considering one, the ability to mobilize investments, based on what we have seen, like with the likes of Flutterwave, as well as their impact in financial inclusion. What do you think would the ecosystem needs more of, or what changes do you hope to happen within the ecosystem, not necessarily based on the central bank's mandate, even outside the central bank?
Thank you, Governor, and good morning, everyone. So to respond to Colin's question, to your question, on the fintech side, I think, first of all, probably I'll go back and probably maybe clarify, because people tend to think fintech is one sector, and Peace explained it. It's really the kind of services you're offering. So if you're a fintech, let's say offering digital lending, then you'll be considered as a non-deposit taking lending financial institution, and there are regulatory framework for that. And it's true on our market, we have two big fintech, I would say, in the payment services, and then others in the remittances. And if you look at even globally, it's true that regulators have sort of struggled, one, in not stifling innovation, so allowing fintechs to not only innovate, be regulated, but not also giving them that space to test their products, which is the sandbox that Peace was referring to. Secondly, on our market, the government through the Ministry of ICT, but BNR is also involved, is developing a national fintech strategy on how one government can support those fintechs. And you've seen there's a lot of support for tech startups, but how do we specifically support fintech and homegrown fintech? And I think one of the initiatives, especially like the Kigali Innovation City, will have specific attention to fintechs. The second is also the fact that the Kigali International Finance Center, through Rwanda Finance, has identified as one of the three key sectors or subsectors of the financial institution they want to attract in the country are fintech. So I think, one, having that national strategy with incentives to fintech and homegrown fintech, as you're mentioning, as well as attracting and building a conducive environment for investors in fintech through Rwanda Finance, and positioning Rwanda as a hub for fintech that will help really the ecosystem. And thirdly, it's also the partnership that as Rwanda through different institutions, we have started with countries that are already advanced. And I think from the central bank point of view, we've been engaging the Monetary Authority of Singapore on, one, understanding how they operationalize their sandbox. Secondly, also the regulatory framework and the challenges they have as a regulator to regulate those new entrants. And the Ministry of ICT is doing the same. Another country we've also engaged is Mauritius. As you know, Mauritius is the first, or I would say largest, international financial center in Africa, and we want to learn best practices from that country. And I think, lastly, you mentioned, and it's a very important point on impact of fintechs or their disruption on financial inclusion. And it's true that where we have fintechs, especially in the payment services space or remittances, we see costs of payment services going down. And we do hope that will be really sort of the main impact we'll see on our financial sector. And as we also see fintechs also outside of payment services, let's say in digital lending and so forth, this is one of the I would say, the positive impact we see on fintechs when we look at its evolution globally. And I think also probably on the investment side, as we've seen African fintechs, I think raising more than $3 billion in 1 year. And as a country that positions itself as a fintech hub, this is also investment we want to see in the country. So that's what I would say on your question. Thank you.
I think on the sectors, the distribution of the loans, the main sectors, we have commerce, that is the new authorized ones. Commerce that had 25.7%. Then public works and building, 21.6%. Personal loans, 15.2%, and manufacturing with 9.8%.
Thank you, Governor. Yes, Clement.
Thank you very much. My name is Clement for Reuters. Governor, you talked about write-offs of 75 billion francs compared to 22 billion. That is percentage-wise 240% or more than 3 times growth increase. Mainly you talked about COVID, but we want to know really these write-offs were in which sectors of the economy, and don't you see it as a threat to the banking sector? Thank you.
Yes. We can take another question.
Murakoze, nitwa Uwimpuhwe Dieudonné, ndi umunyamakuru wa Radio Imanzi. Mwatugaragarije ko ubukungu bw'u Rwanda muri uyu mwaka wa 2022 buzakomeza kuzamuka bishingiye cyane ku kuba icyorezo cya COVID-19 kiri kugenda gicisha make, binajyana no koroshya ingamba zimwe na zimwe. Ndetse mwanakomoje no ku kigega nzahurabukungu nacyo cyagize uruhare cyangwa se kizakomeza no kugira uruhare mu izamuka ry'ubukungu. Nashaka kubabaza ingamba zihari kugira ngo ayo mafaranga atangwa binyuze mu kigega nzahurabukungu agere kuri buri wese. Munatubwire ababa barayahawe uyu munsi bakaba bagaragaza ko n'ubundi basabwa kwishyura ariko ubukungu bwabo butaragera ku kigero gishimishije, cyane ko umuntu yanakwibaza niba ayo mafaranga yatanzwe hari gukurikirana ngo murebe koko yakoze ibyo agombaga gukorwa, ibyo agombaga gukoreshwa, kugira ngo hataba hari uwayafashe akakoresha ibindi bigatuma uyu munsi wenda barimo agorwa no kwishyura kandi ari ngombwa. Hanyuma mu tubwire nyine ingamba zihari zo gukomeza gufasha abo bantu hatumvikana bavuga yuko n'ubundi hafashwa abasanzwe bafite ubukungu bwisumbuyeho. Turabyumva buri wese ntago yamugeraho, n'ibivugwa n'ubitekereza wese ntago amafaranga yamugeraho, niyo mpamvu hagomba kurebwa abantu runaka ageraho. Ariko mubwira icyo abantu bavuga yuko ayo mafaranga mu kigega nzahurabukungu yahawe cyangwa se ahabwa n'ubundi afite ubushobozi bwisumbuye bw'abandi. Murakoze.
Murakoze cyane.
Yeah, thank you, Governor. In response to Clema's question in terms of the written-off loans, so we saw the largest share of those written-off loans being in trade, and then with about 27% of the total written-off loans. And then we had public works, 16.2%, and that's really developers or practitioners in delivering public works, and then commercial real estate with about 14% of the total written-off loans. So in terms of the impact of this on the banking sector, of course it does represent it's a symbol of risk, should I say, also because once you've written these loans off, it's the bank's capital that is really tied up in funds that are irrecoverable, as well as tying up of liquidity. That's the sign of risk that I would say we perceive in terms of written-off loans. Thank you, Governor.
Murakoze, Governor. Nibyo kuko ikigega nzahurabukungu cyagiyeho mu kwezi kwa gatandatu ku mwaka wa 2020 kugira ngo gishyigikire ubucuruzi bwari bufite ibibazo. Amafaranga yagiye, hari igice cyagiye muri sekiteri y'amahoteli, cyane cyane afasha kuvugurura amasezerano y'imyenda ku bari bafite imyenda iri mu mahoteli. Haragiye gufasha urwego rwa transport, public transport, hari nagiye gufasha urwego rw'uburezi, hanyuma hari nagiye gufasha ubucuruzi muri rusange, working capital. So uko twabonye ubwitabire rero twavuga ko nibyo amafaranga ntabwo yari menshi cyane, zari hafi miliyari 100. Ubwitabire rero twavuga ko bwagenze neza, cyane cyane muri izi sector zasabaga kuvugurura imyenda, hanyuma ku gice cy'amafaranga yagiye muri working capital ari hafi miliyari 11 ku kigega cyacungwaga na beneri, ariko hari n'andi yagiye mu kigega gicungwa na BDF cy'ubucuruzi buto buto. Aho ngaho nanashimangire rwose cyangwa ntanga igisobanuro ko aya mafaranga ataragenewe rwose gufasha abasanzwe bifashije gusa kuko icyiciro cy'urwego ruto rw'ubucuruzi cyatekerejweho. Iyo urebye imibare itangwa na BDF, mushobora no kubegera kugira ngo muyibabaze, usanga rwose abagezweho n'ayo mafaranga ari umubare munini, ngira ngo urenze nk'igihumbi ku mibare batanga. Nyine nubwo amafaranga bari make kuko n'ubucuruzi nabwo ubwabo bari ubucuruzi buciriritse, ariko icyo cyiciro rwose cyatekerejweho. Mutese amafaranga yakoreshejwe ibyo yagomba gukoreshwa, twavuga ko yakoreshejwe ibyo yagomba gukoreshwa iyo dukurikije ibiganiro tugirana n'amabanki, tukareba batangiye kwishyura ubushobozi bafite bwo kwishyura, ndetse tukabona ko rwose nta mpungenge, hari n'urwego ruteganyijwe kujyaho gukurikirana uko ayo mafaranga yakoreshejwe. Twumva rero nta mpungenge dufite, cyane cyane iyo turebye imibare cyangwa se ubusobanuro buva mu mabanki. Leta rero akora iki gukomeza gushyigikira ubucuruzi? Hari ingamba zihari, ngira ngo muzazitangirizwa mu minsi iri imbere n'inzego zibishinzwe, ko hashobora kujyaho igice cya kabiri cy'icyo kigega. Murakoze cyane gabana.
Chantal yaravuze, just to gushimangira ibyo yaravuze, ku rwego kuri micro businesses hatanzwe inguzanyo ku bigo 5,000 binyuze muri sako 288. So urumva ko no ku rwego ruciriritse inguzanyo nazo zabagezeho.
Thank you. Dufite ikibazo hari inyuma. Yes.
Murakoze. Nitwa Ndahaye Emmanuel, nkorera Igihe. Gavana, mwagarutse ku cyemezo muherutse gufata cyo kuzamura inyungu fatizo ikagera kuri 5%. Umuntu yakwibaza, ese ko tukiri mu bihe bya COVID-19, tukiri muri recovery, bisa nk'aho izanatwara igihe kirekire, mubona bidashobora guteza disruption wenda mu rwego rw'imari? Umuntu yatanga nk'urugero, wenda bikaba byagira ingaruka zitari nziza ku bwisanzure bw'amabanki mu gutanga inguzanyo, kandi wenda zigikenewe cyane muri ibi bihe tukiri muri recovery ya COVID-19. Murakoze.
Urakoze. Ubukungu, iterambere no ku bukungu bwagira uruhare ku iterambere ry'abantu n'ibikorwa by'abantu, bigira ibintu byinshi bibigenga. Inflation rero cyangwa umuvuduko w'ibiciro ku masoko, iyo ugiye hejuru ugira ingaruka mbi kuri bwa bukungu. Ntabwo iyo ugize umuvuduko w'ibiciro uri hejuru cyane, ibyo wakoze byose byitwa ngo wateye imbere bisa naho bihindutse ubusa, kuko amafaranga umuntu abona, ubushobozi afite bwo kugura ibyo akeneye n'icyo biba biri hasi cyane. So kuba rero twafashe icyemezo cyo kuzamura iyi urwunguko rwa banki nkuru y'igihugu, ni inzira imwe cyangwa se ni igikoresho kimwe gifasha mu gukumira kuzamuka cyane kw'ibiciro ku masoko, kugira ngo bitazagira ya ngaruka mbi ku bukungu muri rusange, cyangwa se no ku muguzi, kuri purchasing power y'abantu n'abatishoboye. Ingaruka ntabwo twiteze ko byagira ingaruka mbi kuri ku mabanki gutanga inguzanyo, kuko n'ubundi amabanki ntabwo atanga inguzanyo ari amafaranga yakuye muri beneri, ko inguzanyo bazitanga ku mafaranga yavuye mu bantu, mu bakiriya babo, niho bakura amafaranga bakoresha mu gutanga inguzanyo. Ikindi, nk'uko nabisobanuriye muri presentation, nubwo twazamuye ariko 5% iracyari mu byo twita accommodative monetary policy, iracyari ku rwego rwo hasi rukomeza gushigikira ko banki zitanga inguzanyo kubikorera. So ntabwo rero ari ikintu tubona ko kizagira ingaruka mbi na gato, ariko ni ubutumwa dutanga, ni igikoresho dufite cyo guhangana na inflation, ariko twumva ko itazagira ingaruka mbi ku mabanki uko batanga inguzanyo muri rusange.
Thank you, Governor. See, no.
My last question. I promise. To Peace, do you have a theory of why the person-to-business values are going down in mobile money payments? Like, what's your theory, or do you have a theory or perception why? Both are welcome.
No, I think there is a likely correlation with the introduction of fees on merchant payments. And even though it is discouraged, there is a likelihood that some merchants require buyers to pay the 0.5, I think, transaction fee, which probably discourages payments via mobile money. I think it may be related to the reintroduction of fees, but it's something that we'll analyze and see.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Governor. Thank you for your time. I think we don't have any more questions from the media houses. I think we can thank you, all of you, for coming and for being with us.
Murakoze cyane mwese, umunsi mwiza.